big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Lease.
It's September 16, 2022, and welcome to Leaders on the Frontier. My name is David Lease, and we tackle big topics, big ideas, and solutions to better serve you Canadians. Our topic today is why the world needs more carbon dioxide. Really? You got to be kidding. In the age of drama around the whole notion that we are in a climate crisis, do we really need new carbon dioxide? Well, we designed that title to be a little bit provocative because we wanted to be able to examine more the science behind climate policy. We know that the federal government's response to this perceived environmental threat has been centered among many policies on a very aggressive campaign to ultimately end the Canadian oil and gas industry. And just recently, even cutting fertilizer use by farmers, which will dramatically, arguably reduce food production. All of these policies are part of a quest to drastically cut carbon dioxide emissions under the rubric of something called Net Zero 50, which aims to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Canadians now are realizing that these are really, in many respects, anti-energy policies that will devastate every economic sector, including agriculture, mining, forestry, and manufacturing, along with making, frankly, the lives of Canadians unaffordable. So we are delighted to have with us the great Dr. Patrick Moore. And I want to introduce him. He's the original environmentalist. Dr. Patrick Moore is the co-founder of Greenpeace. He has played a pivotal role in offering scientific analysis on the state of the environment and frankly, analysis on these policies and climate change. Patrick served as the chair of the CO2 Coalition in 2019 and 20. The CO2 Coalition is a group of eminent thinkers and experts that was established in 2015 for the purpose of educating thought leaders and policymakers and the public about the important contribution made by carbon dioxide into our lives and economy. He has been also a senior fellow at Frontier, and we're delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick Moore.
Thank you, David. That was a nice introduction, and I'm all ready to go here.
Well, I'm delighted that you're here. We're going to do kind of a 101 primer on this topic, trying to always bring it back to science and your insights, Dr. Moore. So what I'd like to do is bring up the slide deck around this overview now so that we can kind of go through it together. But I did want to ask the question, Dr. Moore, how did you end up getting so involved in your concerns about the environment as a scientist?
Well, David, I learned about the word ecology while I was doing my Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Biology. And I'd never heard that word before. That would be in about 1968 or 9. A visiting professor, Vladimir Krajina, came to the forestry faculty to give a noonday speech. That was the first time I'd heard the word ecology. It had not yet been in the popular press at all. It was a word that nobody knew that word. Environment was becoming a much more important word in the late 60s, but ecology had still not been used to describe the environment or nature or how nature works at that time. And so therefore, I enrolled in a PhD in ecology at the Institute of Resource Ecology at UBC. And the rest is history. During my PhD years is when we had our first voyage of Greenpeace against US hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, which we miraculously managed to defeat the world's most powerful organization, the United States Atomic Energy Commission.
Wow.
And stop those tests by getting up and doing something was why it worked. And that was Greenpeace's centerpiece from the very beginning, not just writing letters or marching down the street with a picket sign, but going to the scene of the crime, going out on the high seas for 5 years in a row against the Russian and Japanese whaling fleets that were killing 30,000 great whales each year. And we stopped that too. So, and we cleaned up the rivers mostly in Europe. The North America, both Canada and the US, had passed pretty decent pollution control legislation in the early 70s, but Europe had not. And the Elbe and the Rhine and the Thames and most of the other big rivers in Europe were effectively dead from factories pouring toxic materials into them. And we took a boat up those rivers, and scuba divers went down and plugged the pipes that were underwater so people couldn't see this was happening. And that backed the pollution up into the factory and made news.
Isn't that fascinating background? So if we could bring up the slides now, I'd like to begin with just highlighting a brilliant book. I would strongly recommend it. It's one that you did last year called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Why the title, Patrick?
I realized, David, after working in all these issues for so long, so decades, I realized that all the scare stories were either about things that were invisible, like carbon dioxide, radiation, and whatever is supposed to be bad in GMOs. The funny thing about that is while CO2 and radiation are real things, the bad thing in GMOs doesn't have a name. Everything has a name if you know it's there.
What does GMO stand for again?
Pardon me?
What does GMO stand for again?
Genetically modified foods, organisms.
Genetically modified foods, of course.
Yes. Well, the O stands for organisms, which is kind of a silly word to have chosen.
Yeah.
But that's what GMOs are. And there's been billions of dollars have been raised by anti-GMO organizations around the world. And still a majority of countries will not allow GMOs to be used in agriculture because the campaign against them says there's something bad about them, but whatever is bad about them doesn't have a name.
Right.
So that more or less proves that it doesn't exist.
But I was very much struck in your book, Patrick, how you brilliantly outline the science and really these constant alarm bells we hear in the world and calls for, ringing the bell of climate crisis. You mentioned GMOs, of course, as well, but they're catastrophes that are in many ways being told about the future and are not happening, but they create this enormous fear and anxiety. It's really quite amazing in terms of setting the stage for really quite arguably drastic policies that will affect all of us in terms of our standard of living, our quality of life. Is that not right?
Well, I see it as some kind of suicide pact, actually, this net zero idea. It's more than 80% of our energy they are saying we have to stop using. And on the other hand, it would be actually easy to reduce the use of fossil fuels if nuclear energy was accepted as the alternative. And again, you've got a fear of radiation, which is invisible. And so people can't see what's actually happening.
Okay.
Most people forget that the sunlight is radiation. And if you lay naked in the sun for 8 hours, it's not a good thing for you. And so, the radiation from nuclear plants is infinitesimally small compared to the solar radiation you would get by standing out in the sun. So, but people are afraid. And one way I put it is you're driving down the highway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your grandchildren, and that makes you feel guilty. So the combination of fear and guilt is what's working very effectively here, to the point where we are willing to adopt an energy policy that, if it actually came about, would make World War II look like a picnic. It's just impossible to do what they say we should be doing, but yet they are turning the screws on fossil fuels and on fertilizer now, nitrogen. Okay. And so, the next thing you know, they'll want to ban oxygen. I mean, this is crazy stuff that they are talking about. And it's at a very high level with the World Economic Forum and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all these huge bureaucracies that are ready to take us down a road that would cause more suffering and death than anything that has happened since the Black Plague, I suppose.
So Patrick, quite frankly, that's a shocking kind of message that summarizes the overarching thesis of your work here and by others as well. Let's go to our next slide and start diving through this quickly as we look at understanding better the science, and then I want to get into a larger discussion around some of the contemporary issues. This is where your home is. Is that correct, Patrick?
My home is in Comox on Vancouver Island.
And this picture says Winter Harbor, Vancouver.
Oh, you're showing where I grew up. Yes.
Yes.
I grew up in the house with the arrow pointed at it there. That's my father's logging camp in Winter Harbor on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island. This photo being taken in 1952. Wow. So I was 5 years old at that time.
And now we have a picture of you as what is this exactly here?
The picture of me with the frizzy hair, or which one?
If we go to the next slide, we have a picture of a young man with frizzy hair, and I think that is you. And is that what you?
That is me on the way to Amchitka against the U.S. hydrogen bomb tests. I was in the middle of my PhD there, and the next slide shows most of the whole crew. We look a bit like a bunch of hippies, but most of these people were actually quite professional journalists, lawyers, doctors, PhD students.
Wow. So why did you co-found Greenpeace? You said the importance of action, but is there a moment you can remember when you decided, I'm going to found an organization that does this?
Well, it was a group of us. There was, at the beginning, there was no real leader of this group except a couple of the older guys like Jim Boland in the bottom of the slide with the plaid shirt on in the middle. He was one of the elders, and same with Ben Metcalf up on top, second from the right. They were actually in their 40s and 50s, which most of the rest of us were in our 20s and early 30s range. I was the second youngest of the group, and we just worked together, meeting every week in the basement of the Unitarian Church in Vancouver, which we were given an opportunity to use.
Wow.
And we found a boat. This is where we're standing here. We're standing on the boom of the sail on the Phyllis Cormac, the ship we sailed to Alaska, 85-foot halibut boat. And we helped change the course of history by just getting up and doing something. It was of course the threat of all-out nuclear war that motivated many of us, because it was the height of the Cold War, the height of the Vietnam War. It was the threat of all-out nuclear war and the emerging consciousness of the environment, and these came together in the term Greenpeace. Okay. The peace part, unfortunately, kind of got lost along the way somewhere, and all that was left was the green, because the peace stood for caring about humanity as well as the environment.
Right.
That was the whole purpose of this synthesis of these two words, was to save humanity from all-out nuclear war, which would also have a huge effect on the environment. And it's a shame in a way that the environmental movement, one of the reasons I had to leave in the end at a philosophical level, was they began to say that humans are the enemies of the earth, that humans are the enemies of nature. And that was just way too much like original sin for me. I'm not a fire and brimstone guy. And I prefer love over that, and love of the earth and love of humanity.
And part of love is truth as well.
Yes, and they are not separable. We are part of nature. We evolved with all the other species through the course of history. We're a latecomer, but we seem to have some fairly unique qualities. And I just think that we've actually done a pretty good job for a species that has multiplied so rapidly as we have in terms of, here's a fact that not many people know. By about 1750, 1800, Europe had been reduced to less than 10% forest cover. Before fossil fuels, wood was used for everything that needed energy, heating every home and building, doing smelting steel and copper and steam engines, and everything was done with wood. So this was the first time in history that a population became dense enough and had the technology to be able to actually start decimating the forest. They would grow back fast enough in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why silviculture, otherwise known as tree farming, was developed in Europe, because it was the first place in the world that had this problem. Today, 43% of Europe, including East and West, is forested.
Wow.
With most,
so that's a great news story, is it not, Patrick?
Well, you'd think so, but there's, and these stories of the Amazon and the Congo being deforested, I mentioned about how invisible things are used to create fear because people can't observe for themselves what's actually happening. You can't see what CO2 is doing. They just make up a big scare story about it. And so many people have bought into it because they can't negate it, because you can't see it. Mm-hmm. It's not just things you can't see, it's also things that are very remote. That is why polar bears and coral reefs are used as icons for the climate change catastrophe.
Oh, no, that's fascinating.
But when you come to polar bears and coral reefs, start with coral reefs. In 2016, in the spring, it was announced that 93% of the Great Barrier Reef was practically dead or dying or almost dead or bleached or in its final terminal stage, as if there were other terminal stages before the final one. They're pretty good with language. But note that none of those said dead. Practically dead isn't dead. So they got away with saying that 93% of the Great Barrier Reef was practically dead. This year, just a couple months ago, the Australian Institute for Marine Science, which has been part of the sensationalism around the death of the reef, had to admit that they're been measuring the amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef for 36 years now. There's more this year than there has ever been in all of their records. So that is a fact, and there's simply no question about it. Wow. With polar bears, no one has heard that in 1973, all polar nations signed an international treaty ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears. You never see that in the media. But it did happen, and it has been enforced through the years to where the population had been reduced to somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 around the entire Arctic by 1973, because it was getting easier and easier to fly up there and hire an Inuit guide and get some polar bear rugs. So when that was stopped, the population today is between 30 and 50,000 polar bears. Coca-Cola never tells you that or about the treaty, but that is a fact. So what they're resorting to now is saying that yes, but by 2100 by 2100 they'll all be dead.
Wow. So again, what you're saying is that it's such a different message from what we typically hear, a very different perspective. And, I will never forget, was it a magazine, I'm not sure if I should name it or not, but featured an emancipated older polar bear that seemed to be dying. And this was given as an example of what's happening to the polar bears. And I think that you're quite familiar with that story. What happened?
It was National Geographic, David, and they had a cut line under this poor old polar bear, dragging its hind legs behind it, obviously starving to death. Mm-hmm. It said, "This is the face of climate change." What it was a picture taken in the summer. There was no snow, and people think there's snow in the Arctic all year, but the islands up there, the snow melts in a lot of places in the summer. So they made it seem that was because it was too hot. But many people don't realize that in the summer for 6 months, you get 24 hours a day of sunshine. So the difference between the summer and the winter in the Arctic is profound, as during the winter, you get no sunshine for 6 months in a row. And that's why there's still a huge ice cap up there, and because of the general climate of the Earth. See, the irony of all of this is that on 3 counts, 1, it is colder now on Earth than it was for the previous 250 million years. This is the Pleistocene Ice Age. The previous ice age, named the Karoo, ended 250 million years ago. After 1 million years, that was a 1 million year long ice age.
I think we have a slide on that. If we could just go ahead for a sec there. I think there's a slide illustrating that, is there not?
There's lots of slides on that, but I just want to show you
going forward here.
Let's do a series of slides here. I want to start with number 21, and we'll go backwards with them. This is the slide of the last 570 million years. Temperature in blue, CO2 in purple. As you can see, there is very little correlation between the two. In some places, they're in sync with each other, but in a lot of places, like that big red circle, they're totally out of sync with each other for 150 million years. Then comes the Eocene thermal maximum. If you show the next slide, slide number 20. We're going backwards in time, or coming closer to the present. This is the last 65 million years. So as you can see, the Earth is at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period right now. And they're saying it's too hot. All the life on Earth went through the Eocene thermal maximum, otherwise it wouldn't be here anymore. So all our ancestors lived through that, and all the ancestors of everything that is living here today lived through that. And yet you can see it was like many degrees warmer than it is now. And they're telling us we have to worry about 1 degree of warming, when actually New York and Washington, D.C. are more than 1 degree apart in their annual temperature.
Just pause for a sec, if we can understand this as a layperson, and I'm trying to remember all my geography and geological courses. But what we have here is the assertion today of a climate crisis that says it is a crisis because of a 1 degree warming of, quote, average Earth's temperatures over what period of time again?
At any period of time. They're saying that another 1 degree Celsius on top of the 1 degree Celsius that has already occurred since 1700. And I'll get to that as we move up here. Let's go to slide number 19 now. This is the last 5.5 million years from marine sediment cores. And oxygen-18 that is an isotope that is able to help us determine what the temperature was. Now, if the onset of the Pleistocene shown there at 2.6 million years ago is, of course, arbitrary, but it went down below zero. Note that the ice ages are getting colder. That's the bottom part of the curves. This is how many glaciations there have been since the onset of the Pleistocene. People think the last glacial event was the ice age, the end of the ice age, when it melted and is like today. Although it didn't completely melt, there are still massive ice sheets on both poles, and no sign they're going away anytime soon. In fact, Antarctica had the coldest winter that has ever been measured since people went there and measured it this last winter.
So can you repeat that?
The coldest winter in Antarctica that's ever been recorded. And in the Arctic, this year, the Arctic ice in the summer has not receded as much as it did for the last 10 years or so. So it's actually grown larger. And we can expect there's cycles on cycles on cycles in the climate. This one is showing the 41,000 year cycle that occurred for the first 1.5 million years. And then it suddenly switched to a 100,000 year cycle. These are both related to the gravitational effect of Jupiter on the tilt of the Earth and the orbit of the Earth. Hardly anybody knows that either.
Well, so you're saying that the whole issue of climate is really quite mind-boggling in terms of its variables. It's not just related to one gas, but it's related to many things, not the least of which are the sun, but also even gravitational relationships with the planets. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's clear. They're so closely aligned that it's almost impossible to imagine that they're not a cause-effect relationship.
Wow.
Let's go back to number 18 now. Vostok ice core data from Antarctica. This shows the most recent 4 glacial cycles out of more than 40, going back 2.6 million years. This is just 300,000, 350,000 years or so. And you can see that these are very cyclical, that they're kind of a sawtooth in nature where the temperature goes down very slowly, but then comes back up into the interglacial periods, which are named there. But you can see that the previous 3 interglacial periods were warmer than this one. That's one thing you see there. There's 3 things there that you see. The second is that at the last glaciation, which is the lowest point at the bottom there where it says lowest known CO2 level in Earth's history, 180 parts per million. This is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. Plants don't just need CO2, they need a certain level of it, just like we need a certain level of oxygen to survive. We can't survive on an atmosphere of 5% oxygen, which is 5,000 parts per million. Amazingly, plants can live on 180 parts per million of CO2. It's absolutely miraculous.
Wow.
But the third thing to notice is you see the blue line going up there to 2020 at 415 parts per million. Why hasn't the temperature followed that line? I mean, if it's the control knob of global temperature. The reason is because even though it looks like there, you could say, well, look, the CO2 must be driving the temperature because they're in such close correlation. But that's where Al Gore got it exactly backwards. And that's what there are so many things exactly backwards about the climate catastrophe. Number one, I mentioned earlier, it's actually colder now than it has been for most of the history of life on Earth. We're in an ice age. But secondly, CO2 is lower now than it has been in all the history of the Earth, pretty much. You saw that in the first slide of the 500 million years. It was 5,000 parts per million 500 million years ago, and it went down to 180. That's because it is the temperature that's driving the CO2 in this graph.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify,
explain why. When the oceans warm, they give off gas. When the oceans cool, they absorb gas. The oceans have 50 times as much CO2 in them as the atmosphere does. So a small change in oceanic CO2 percentage makes a big change in the atmosphere. That's what's happening here. Especially now that CO2 is at such a low level, it doesn't take much. And I want to give you an example. When you take a glass of cold water out of the fridge and put it on the counter, small bubbles appear on the inside of the glass when it warms up. That's the gas coming out. And the ocean does the same thing when it warms up. So it's actually the temperature changes that are causing the CO2 to change. And that tail end up there to 2020, that's us doing that. We put that CO2 in the atmosphere and are bringing it back to a level that is much more conducive to the growth of trees and all other plants, including our food crops. It's one of the reasons why there are bumper crops every year. The CO2 increase is responsible for about 70% of the increased yield in food crops that has occurred over the last 50, 60 years, since we really started pumping it in. Now, let's go back two slides to number 16. And this is the longest continuous measurement of temperature with a thermometer. Thermometer wasn't invented till about 1650. And so it goes back before 1700, it goes back And you can see that the temperature has gone up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, but basically in a straight line. Whereas the black line is the amount of CO2 we have been putting into the atmosphere, which has been increasing exponentially on an annual basis. Why hasn't the temperature followed that line if CO2 is responsible for the temperature of the Earth? That's because it isn't responsible for the temperature of the Earth. There are many other factors involved, and CO2 is such a small factor that it is easily overwhelmed by other factors. And if you look back at the very beginning of the temperature graph, you will see there's a period there from the late 1600s into the 1730s, where the temperature rises more and for longer than at any other place in that temperature curve. And there was no CO2 being put into the atmosphere by people when that blip happened. So I believe this is one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence, and especially in the modern times. There's much evidence going back as well, as you have seen.
So this is quite fascinating, because it's almost like we've got it upside down, where carbon dioxide is seen as the main control knob, if to quote you, but it's actually temperature, and when that's the control knob really for climate. Is that right?
Well, of course, yes. The CO2 doesn't have much to do with the climate, unless you believe that it is the control knob for temperature. But it obviously isn't. At many time scales, you can see that it isn't. And that these ice ages, we don't know why the ice ages happen. The one plausible theory is that it has to do with the tectonic plates and their positioning on the surface of the Earth. You may know that at one time they were all one piece of land, and I forget what its name was now, but that was a long time ago. But as ocean currents, as land masses open up and ocean currents can go in different directions, a lot of people think that might be part of the reason, because it has no pattern. The ice ages don't come regularly. The glaciations during the ice age come regularly, like I showed you, for every 100,000 years or every 40,000 years, depending on which part of the Pleistocene you were in. Those are quite regular, but there's no regularity to the ice ages themselves. There's shorter ones and longer ones. They don't come in regular sequence of any kind. This Pleistocene ice age just happened.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that's fascinating about your message here is that carbon dioxide is foundational for life. It's actually, the carbon dioxide levels have always varied throughout history, but it's foundational to life. In fact, not too far from here is a greenhouse where they pump carbon dioxide into the greenhouse to encourage plant growth.
That's the case in virtually every commercial greenhouse in the world. And greenhouse growing is expanding rapidly because you can grow a lot more food in a controlled environment like that, especially if you can double or triple the CO2 level in there. It's just standard procedure. And they have what are called CO2 generators. All they are is natural gas being burned inside the greenhouse, and that produces the CO2. So it's not a very difficult technology.
Yeah, right.
And it really does pay. Now, it's thought that CO2 continues to increase the growth rate up to at least 2,000 and perhaps 3,000 parts per million. But growers don't put that much in because there's a law of diminishing returns involved. In other words, for each % increase of CO2, you don't get the same increase in growth. It tapers off as you get towards the optimum for growth. So the optimum economically is somewhere in between there. And but it's standard practice for anybody who's growing tomatoes and cucumbers and flowers and whatever else inside a greenhouse is to double and triple the CO2. And so that's the great irony of it is it's colder now and there's less CO2 now than there has been through the most of the history of life on Earth. And people say, yeah, but humans weren't around back then.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, we sort of were, in the sense that we wouldn't be here if we died out back then. from too much heat or too much CO2. Every single living thing, every individual living thing of every species, 1.7 million identified species, and there's 8 billion of us, and how many ants are there and how many bumblebees are there? Every one of those individuals represents a continuous successful reproduction since the beginning of life. Think about that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here anymore. The bush of the evolutionary tree has been pruned very heavily through the ages. And during the major extinction events, most of which I believe, we know the most recent one, 65 million years ago, was an asteroid impact that it punctured the Earth's crust and sent billions of tons of material into the stratosphere, where it blocked out the sun for many years.
So let's just clarify that. So in the popular media, I've heard this so many times that we've actually have a major extinction going on of species. Now, we know from archaeological history that you had the asteroid event, the big one. But what do you have to say then that we're losing? Are we not losing a lot of species, or is that an issue in your mind? What is your scientific perspective on that?
I managed to get into a testimony before the U.S. Congress Committee on Wildlife and Nature, where these 3 United Nations people, claiming they were scientists, said, yes, we have identified 1.7 million species, but we think there's 8 million species, and that half of those are going to go extinct in the next 50 years, whatever. That they actually said that. They had no names for these other nearly 6 million species or whatever. And that is the argument they used, that the best estimate is that there's actually 8 million species when we only know of 1.7. Now, sure, there's a few species we don't know about, but there's not that many. And so they just make up numbers. And so all of a sudden 2 million species could go extinct and you wouldn't know it had happened because you didn't know they were there in the first place. So there isn't a high rate of extinction now. And in fact, if you look at the number of taxonomic families there are today, it is higher than virtually any other time in the history of life. It's been the evolution of life has been a constant diversification of life. And then an extinction event will come along and kill like 80% of the species. The Permian extinction 250 million years ago was the biggest one. And it only took some millions of years for that to come back to where it was before and then go higher again. So the power of evolution on this earth for the diversity of species is an incredible thing. And yet we're being told that there's a species extinction disaster going on. It is not true. There is not a disaster of extinction going on. And there have been species go extinct all through the history of life, of course, even when there weren't asteroids hitting the earth. It's the survival of the fittest. And the interesting thing is that the species that are alive today are clearly the fittest, because they survived longer than any others did, because they go back to the beginning of life. So I find it all quite magical and beautiful and wonderful. You see, I don't find it scary and horrible and dying, not in the slightest.
Well, I want to kind of shift to a number of questions, and I would really appreciate your perspective on it, because it's just fascinating how this issue has been around the claims of climate crisis for some time, and the problems with carbon dioxide. And you've shown eloquently that carbon dioxide is actually foundational to human life. I was fascinated to learn that just recently, I believe it is actually the end of August, there was a major declaration of some 1,100 scientists and professionals said that there is no climate emergency, and it was signed as a world climate declaration stating this idea. And I believe you signed it as well. You were signature number 1000. Can you tell us more about that statement and why you think it was important to sign it, Patrick?
Well, it's important because there is no climate emergency. It's all a fabrication. The climate has always included extreme weather. Like hurricanes aren't something new. As a matter of fact, there's very few of them so far this year. It's a very mild year for hurricanes in the world's oceans. And maybe I want to explain why the carbon dioxide fell to such a low level over history, because it went from 5,000 ppm when modern life emerged, the Cambrian explosion in the 500 million year range ago, when there was no multicellular life before that. For more than 3 billion years, all life was unicellular, microscopic, and confined to the sea. And then multicellular life forms emerged and flourished. They just exploded. That's why they call it the Cambrian explosion. But those were all soft-bodied creatures. But what didn't take long, well, it took millions of years, but in the scheme of things, it didn't take long for many of those marine species, which was all there was then. There was basically no life on the land until quite a long time later. Those marine species learned to make armor plating for themselves, otherwise known as shells, by combining calcium with carbon dioxide and making calcium carbonate. If you would show slide number 22. This is the result of the Global Carbon Project, which published this in 2010, and I have updated it to include the more atmospheric CO2 and the more fossil burning 10 billion tons of carbon equivalent of burning fossil fuels. This is where the carbon is. The red is flows, movement from one place to another. The blue is stocks, the stock of carbon that is there on a regular basis. But the flows occur between the plants and the atmosphere, and the ocean and the atmosphere, and the life in the ocean and the atmosphere. So there's all these flows going on. But at the same time, you can see there that compared to the 850 billion tons of carbon that are in CO2 in the atmosphere, there are still between 5 and 10,000 billion tons of carbon in fossil fuels. All of that carbon was taken from the atmosphere and from the oceans. The atmosphere, on the land, coal was produced from forests. In the oceans, oil and gas were produced by the remains of marine creatures. That is where the carbon went, and it's still there. It's locked up, otherwise known as sequestered. But the biggest amount of carbon that we know of is in the Earth's crust as carbonaceous rocks. Limestone, chalk, the White Cliffs of Dover are made of the skeletons of coccolithophores, which are a phytoplankton that is microscopic in size. And the coral reefs over the last 400 million years have produced about half of this. This is known as limestone, chalk, and marble. It is of life origin, most of it. In other words, 100 billion tons of carbon have been removed from the atmosphere, and either through chemical means or mostly life processes have been lost to the carbon cycle of life.
Well, that's actually quite mind-boggling, Patrick, to put that into perspective. So that would explain how those things absorbed so much of that carbon, and why, in perspective, our carbon levels are actually relatively low. Is that what you're saying?
They're extremely low. You see, the creation of armor plating in the same way that knights in shining armor put steel plates all over themselves.
Okay.
That's what life did in the sea. But it was a great invention. I mean, imagine the difference between a hard clamshell and the soft organism inside, how much protected it is. So it was a huge evolutionary advantage, but it presaged the end of life. Because eventually, all of the carbon would be sucked out to the level where it wasn't enough for anything to grow anymore.
So this is really incredible insight. So if we look at the Canadian context, then we've benefited by luck, so to speak, that we have this incredible fossil fuel resources or carbon that we can share with the rest of the world. Is that not right? That's an incredible opportunity then.
It is, but there's no need to be burning it so quickly. And that has nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with the conservation of a resource that is useful for certain things that you can't do it with other things, like moving, like vehicles, for example. This idea that all the cars are going to be electric is completely nuts. Never mind that it's all going to be wind and solar. But let me just carry on here just a little bit more. The development of calcareous shells in marine species presage the end of life. Therefore, we are the salvation of life, not its destroyer, because we are putting some back where it came from. You see, all the carbon that is in the fossil fuels and the carbonaceous rocks came from the atmosphere and the oceans, all of it. It was already there. It isn't as if we're adding something new to the atmosphere.
It's within a cycle.
Well, and we are integral to that cycle. There is no other species on Earth that can burn limestone to make concrete, to make cement. And that's about 5% of all our CO2 emissions are from cement manufacturing. The rest is from fossil fuels. But in the long term, we don't need to be burning that. We've really increased the level of CO2 in the atmosphere by 40% in 60, 80 years. So we don't need to burn the fossil fuels so quickly. We should use nuclear energy. There are 440 nuclear plants operating safely all around the world. Only one ever caused a problem, and it was a stupid Russian design. And it wasn't even during normal operating procedures that it blew up. It was because of an experiment they were doing. And they told the operators to turn off the safety system so they could do their experiment. And it had the unfortunate design flaw of being capable of being a nuclear explosion. And that's what Chernobyl was. 3 Mile Island and Fukushima were not nuclear explosions. They were meltdowns of the core due to loss of coolant. Because when you shut down a nuclear reactor, you have to keep cooling it for 4 or 5 days until the very hot fission products are gone, or mostly gone, because many of them decay very rapidly. And as long as the reactor's being cooled, and of course it's cooled always while it's operating, and has to be cooled for another 4 or 5 days. At Fukushima, what happened is the tsunami washed away the backup diesel pumps, which were stupidly in front of the reactors on skids 8 feet above sea level. And so it was an hour after the earthquake that the tsunami hit, and everything had been going fine until then. The backup generators were working and the cooling systems were working. 3 Mile Island was a much less severe thing than even Fukushima. There was not enough radiation from that to ever cause any harm. And no one died from radiation at Fukushima either. And only 86 people died from Chernobyl, most of who were firefighters that spent 10 days right at the core of the reactor trying to put the fire out that was caused by massive carbon that was used as a moderator for the reactor, by pure carbon, like carbon black. And that caught on fire. And when carbon catches on fire, it's really hard to put out. Same with these lithium-ion batteries. When they catch on fire, you can't put them out just by pouring water on them. It just keeps burning.
Okay, so from your insight and analysis, strategically, you would be an advocate for the importance of nuclear energy. Is that correct?
Yes. Instead of 400, there should be 4,000. And you see, the thing about nuclear energy is that it can do anything that requires heat and electricity that is stationary. And that includes all the buildings in the world. We are using fossil fuels to provide the heat and electricity for buildings when there's no need for that. Fossil fuels are needed for semi-tractor trucks, for big farm equipment, for big mining equipment. We should be saving it for that and using nuclear energy to do, and not only that, but nuclear energy can also power all the trains because you can electrify the tracks. Nuclear propulsion could power all the big ships on the sea. If you can take a submarine underwater with 100 nuclear weapons on it for 3 months on nuclear power, you can probably do any boat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Russia has 6 nuclear powered icebreakers in a civilian fleet, and there are 6 nuclear navies in the world with submarines and aircraft carriers and battleships running on nuclear power. There's enough nuclear energy to last for hundreds of thousands of years. And it is, in fact, probably the safest technology per megawatt produced that there is. A lot safer than fossil fuels, which cause quite a few deaths every year.
So in that context, Patrick, there almost seems to be confusion then that somehow we're berated by Greta Thunberg, who says, "How dare you," as an advocate for, quote, green energy, wind, solar. Is it really green? And that includes the world of electric cars that you alluded to earlier. Are you an advocate for those types of energy sources? How do you view them?
I think anybody who has enough money to afford an electric car and think it's cool, that's fine, if that's what they want to buy.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that we are going to now mandate electric cars for everybody, that you won't be allowed to buy a gasoline operated car or a diesel operated car or a natural gas operated car, I believe that is, well, they're using all kinds of words for taking away people's freedom of choice these days. But I can't see any reason for that. The CO2 is not an issue. See, that's as soon as you decide that CO2 is not an issue, that it isn't what's causing the Earth to warm in the modern warm period, which is not as warm as the medieval warm period, and definitely not as warm as the Roman period.
Mm-hmm.
I got another slide here that maybe I should show because it's slide number 17. This is the past 5,000 years.
Oh, yes, right. Mm-hmm.
And there's the Roman warming, which was preceded by the Minoan warming, which was followed by the medieval warming, which is now in the modern warming.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 5,000-year cooling trend. We appear to be descending into the 80,000-year descent into the next glacial maximum. Don't have to worry too much about it right now. Don't have to worry about much right now because the Earth is warming a little bit, and that is good because the little ice age, there were crop failures and starvation. The medieval warming period was the period of cathedral and castle building.
Mm-hmm.
There's
and
a whole book
winemaking.
on it. There's a whole book on it. Yeah, and winemaking. But and the Roman Empire, during that time, the tree level in the Alps was at least 500 to 1,000 feet higher than it is now, which indicates that it was warmer. And indeed, we know for a fact that the sea level was 1 to 2 meters higher during the Roman warm period, because when the Romans basically conquered southern England
Mm-hmm.
around the time of Christ, all the castles on the rivers are way upstream. And they were where the docks were.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. There's remains of Russian docks that are 1 to 2 meters above the present sea level. So it was warmer then. There was less ice on the poles. And we have continued to make this gradual descent into a colder climate. And seeing as though there's already been somewhere between 40 and 44 glacial advances during this Pleistocene ice age, it's a pretty good bet there's going to be another one, the way things are shaping up here.
Wow.
So it in other words, Canada will have to be evacuated one day again.
No, it's fascinating perspective that you offer, given this background and information. I guess what strikes me, Patrick, is, and we've talked about this before, is how so much of our environment is actually good news in terms of the greening of the world. And again, if you believe that carbon dioxide is actually seminally foundational for human life, then that should drive public policy in a very constructive way that's helpful. And yet we seem to be either suppressing that good news or worse, even scaring people into believing that the world is coming to an end.
Yes, they say there's too much of a good thing. If you remind them that CO2 is a necessity for life, but it was a necessity for life when it was at 5,000 ppm, and the world was much warmer. Let's go to slide number 25, the polar bears.
Nice picture.
You see, these are called sea bears, is one of their main nicknames. They're very happy in the ocean. They're not going to drown. And when they jump in the water, they know where they're going next. So this whole thing about them drowning and standing lonely on a little piece of ice is complete nonsense. But the funniest thing of all is that the cut line at the bottom there, polar bears would not exist if it weren't for climate change. Now, I showed the graph of how the last 50 million years has been a constant cooling trend, and that there was no ice on the Arctic until about 3 million years ago.
Sorry, can you
The Arctic islands, the Arctic islands were covered in forests. The remains of them are there still, the fossils, with giant camels bigger than any camel there is today roaming in those forests. 3 to 5 million years ago. That's what it was like up there.
Wow,
there
amazing.
was no ice. Therefore, there could be no polar bears. Where do people think polar bears came from? How did they evolve? They came from the Eurasian brown bear, which is what we call grizzly bear. When the Bering Land Bridge opened up during the various glacial maximums, because it made the sea go down 400 feet, that's how people got to the New World, and that's how grizzly bears got to the New World, and reindeer, which we call caribou, and the timber wolf is an old world species, and moose is an old world species. All 5 of those species I just mentioned came from the old world to the New World across the Bering Land Bridge. Humans during the most recent glaciation, so that would be 15, 16, 17,000 years ago, that humans came, but some of these other species may have come earlier than that. I don't know the answer to that, actually. I'm not sure if anybody does. But anyways, polar bears wouldn't exist if the Arctic hadn't frozen over, and brown bears went out onto the ice to eat seals. And then they turned into polar bears over 500,000 years. So that if you look at the next slide, number 26, that brown bear turned into that white bear. And this is called divergent evolution. It occurs for 2 reasons. Sometimes both are involved. One is if a subpopulation gets isolated from the other subpopulation, after a long, long time, they follow their own evolutionary path. Or if they're in really different environments, like on the ice versus on the land in northern Russia or Europe. That's why the polar bear turned white, because it was good for camouflage out there. But it does take a long time. It's not as if it happens in 3 months. But interestingly enough, even though these 2 species diverged as long ago as 500,000 years or more, they can still breed with each other, which technically is the definition of a species, if you can breed and produce a viable young. In other words, the young.
So they have these points of differentiation, but they are the same species.
Well, no. And if you told the world's expert on that, Susan Crockford, she'd slap you around.
Okay.
Because she says they're different species.
Okay.
And I believe, and I'll take her word for it. They're different enough that they've been given different Latin names. And yeah, it's okay to call them different species.
Oh, that's interesting. But Patrick, the point though is that the polar bears are doing well. Is that your sense of it?
Oh, absolutely. There's simply no doubt about it. That's why you don't hear that much about them anymore. They carried on about this for quite a while, and it's Susan Crockford and myself to some extent that have brought this to the attention of people, and they know they can't lie about this any longer. If you look at the slide number 29, I think that's what it is, with the map. Yeah, slide number 29, showing the various populations of polar bears. None of them are declining.
Wow.
They've increased from 1973. See, in 1973, wildlife biologists became concerned and went to the leaders of the polar countries and said, your population is declining because too many are being hunted by big game hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no control. There was no limit on how many could be killed. And so they have returned to a population of 30 to 50,000. And the Inuit people who run Nunavut, there's an Inuit government in Nunavut on Baffin Island, where they have passed a polar bear management plan 2 years ago because they think there's too many bears in some of the parks. And it had been so strict that you could not kill a polar bear even if it was eating your people. You know, not that happens regularly, but there have been Inuit people killed by polar bears, and people are afraid to kill them because they'll get sent to jail. And that has been changed. Now it is okay now to defend your life and your family's life and your home from polar bears.
So again, Patrick, this is a message you just don't hear very often at all. But it's actually a good news story that polar bears are thriving to the point where they have to introduce what you refer to as a polar bear management program to kind of make sure there aren't too many of them. Is that what you said?
Well, no, it's not a culling program. It's a program that allows people to defend themselves from polar bears.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and killing them if they have to.
Right.
In order to avoid being killed themselves or having their home ransacked.
Wow.
So here's the picture of what we were talking about before, number 27. If you bring that one up.
That's
now,
the emancipated.
That's the National Geographic December 2017, where they said this is what climate change looks like. When in fact, the vast majority of polar bears die of starvation, because they're too old to be able to catch their prey anymore.
Right.
But nothing is going to try to eat them. They could take your face off with that front paw, no trouble at all, even when they're dying.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they'd probably like to do it. And so this bear probably has no teeth left. It's probably got that hip problem in its hips where they're not working, they're dragging their legs around. There are no nursing homes for old polar bears.
Right.
You know, and it's a tough life when you have to die of starvation.
Wow. So it appears to be that they were kind of spinning that picture, the tragedy of an old polar bear passing away as due to quote climate change, when in fact it has nothing to do with each other.
Absolutely nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with being an old polar bear.
Yeah.
And all polar bears die someday. So just like everyone does. And I thought this was so rude, disrespectful, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. I actually quit my subscription to National Geographic in 1999. My dad had given it to me as a child. But they had an article called "The Sixth Great Extinction," like we were talking about before.
Yes, right.
They had this big article about how all the species were going to go extinct, and it's a lie. There was a pulse of extinctions that was caused by the European colonization of the world, and it was because they brought rats, cats, and foxes and snakes with them, and in many species, especially on islands, rats on islands, right? They eat all the birds' eggs. That pulse is over to all extent. and purposes. And a few species did go extinct from those migrations of exotic species from one place to another. But it's not like what they're saying. There isn't an extinction crisis any more than there's a climate crisis.
No, it's fascinating. And when you think of this type of information and policies that are really having a significant cost then on people, including Canadians, I want to turn now to the whole issue of fertilizer emissions. And as you know well, there's a whole series of federal targets involved to somehow limit carbon dioxide. And this will be very costly. It will result in food prices. The agricultural industry feels, quite frankly, under attack. And this will have massive impacts on food production. So what's your take on, frankly, it seems like the insanity, the disconnect between the science and the associated policy, and then its pain and impact on people?
There is absolutely no proof that nitrogen is causing climate change. None, any more than there is for CO2. It's the same garbage. And it is actually an attack on the population of the country to do this. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Haber-Bosch process, which was discovered, invented in the early 1900s, and then became a large industry by the 1930s. Haber invented the process of being able to combine nitrogen in the atmosphere with natural gas,
right,
to make ammonia. And Bosch industrialized it, scaled it up to industry scale. Each one of them got a Nobel Prize for their role in doing that, because at least half the population of the Earth today depends upon that nitrogen. Our amino acids and our proteins and our muscles and stuff are made in have nitrogen in them. So nitrogen, in some ways, after carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which form the carbohydrates, the sugars, and the starches, and also the fats, nitrogen is next in line as the most important, and also is essential. I mean, it's just simple, totally essential. So it's just as important in that sense as the other ones that are essential. And so they are threatening here huge swaths of the global population not being able to survive, because that's why the yields are so high, is because they figured out how to fix nitrogen. Most people don't realize that most of life is not capable of getting the nitrogen for itself. In the same way that CO2 is passed on to us through plants as sugars for energy and foodstuffs for substance, the nitrogen fixing bacteria are an essential species for the growth of plants. And many plants have a symbiotic relationship. The whole pea family, for example, the beans and the peas, all the legumes, have nodules on their roots in which they house nitrogen fixing bacteria. The bacteria get a safe place to live, and they get sugar from the leaves of the tree coming down, and they send nitrogen up. And that is by far the largest source of nitrogen coming into the food chain of life on Earth, is nitrogen fixing bacteria. Lightning strikes also cause some nitrogen to be fixed, as it's called, to become basically like ammonia, which is the basis for all the nitrogen fertilizers. So this is just like with CO2 being the most essential for life on Earth, because they feed the plants, which then feed us. If it wasn't for plants, there wouldn't be any of us, because we can't fix CO2, that's for sure. And the the nerve of these people who have no science at all. I don't even know if half of them ever had a decent job in their lives. And they are making these policies which are so fundamentally destructive of our future that it's hard to imagine that they're doing this, but they are.
Yeah.
And
So what do you really think is going on here, Patrick? Like, if you look strategically at it, we've got this whole bizarre policy movement built on the false premise that carbon dioxide is basically pollution, right?
yes,
And then they're introducing even the movement around nitrogen, and it's the same kind of thesis, right? So these are policy dead ends. They're going to impact not just agriculture, but really arguably every area of industry, because it's going to impact, well, it's not just the fossil fuel industry. It's clearly forestry, it's mining, it's manufacturing, it's everybody. So why
I've got
are we doing this?
a little ditty that goes renewable, clean, sustainable, and green. And people think those things all kind of mean the same thing, but they don't. They're very different from each other. Renewable means renews itself without our assistance, like trees, for example. That's clear. Clean means not polluted, not poisoned. It's a very simple word, clean. That's what it means in ecology or environment. Sustainable, well, sustainable and renewable are completely different terms in that there's enough iron ore in the Earth's crust to last forever. So iron ore is sustainable even though it's not renewable. And many renewable resources are unsustainable if they're over-harvested. So those two words have to be very clearly differentiated from each other. The final word, green, is a completely meaningless term. It has no definition in science of any sort. It's sort of like using the word organic to describe foodstuffs.
Right.
All foods are organic. As in the actual scientific meaning of organic, which is organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon, nothing else. It's the chemistry of life. Whereas all the other elements are called inorganic chemistry, whether it's steel or copper or chlorine or whatever. All other 95 of them, or however many there are called inorganic chemistry. That's the scientific meaning of organic. But there is no scientific meaning of green. It is a fake public relations term.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight.
Because the wind technology and the solar technology is not renewable. It's all made out of non-renewable materials, and it doesn't last very long, like a 20-year lifespan compared to a nuclear plant at 60 to 80 years, gas plant 60 years. So you have to build 3 times as many solar panels and windmills as you do to get the same amount of energy for those other technologies. But most importantly, it only works about a third of the time.
Yeah.
And they
so how is that sustainable, reliable?
Yeah, exactly. But listen to this analysis. Okay, you need 100 megawatts of energy to supply a certain sized town. When the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining, you maybe are going to get 100 megawatts of energy, so that's fine. But what about when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing? Then they say we're going to use batteries for 2/3 of the time.
Right.
That means and it also means that while you are supplying the 100 megawatts to the city when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you have to also be charging the batteries. And you need twice as much power in the batteries as you're able to produce with the wind and solar, because you only get wind and solar a third of the time. So now you have to have 3 times as much wind and solar as you would have to have nuclear or gas or hydroelectric in order to run the system. And it's way worse than that. It gets worse. Believe me. Wow. It's not going to happen. That is the actual fact of it. It's not going to happen. And yet they're going to try and force it to happen. And I hope California and Germany continue on and show the world how it doesn't work, because it won't work.
these kinds of policies, we would often refer to them at Frontier as frankly policy dead ends. They're really not grounded in the reality of both good policy principles or
Yeah.
facts or science from our perspective. And so that it will frankly have a massive impact on people's lives. And we see this very much happening not only in North America, but certainly in Europe. If you look at the closure of various agricultural operations, like where they're growing tomatoes or shutting down even breweries to major steel mills now because of the high price of energy, which is almost arguably self-imposed pain. So what is, if it's not based on solid policy, let alone science, Patrick, why are we doing this? Why are we going up these so-called policy dead ends? Did you have a kind of a larger theory on that for
We
fear
must
of
repent. Yes, we must repent for our
we
sins.
must repent? Okay, what do you mean
Yes.
by that? That we're somehow
We must
irredeemable?
we must feel guilty. And we must send big checks to Greenpeace, who don't know what they're going to do with them except waste our money. So,
Okay,
it's a completely bizarre situation, David. There's no counting for it.
wow. Because it almost seems like we're adopting both an ideology quasi-religion with all the
Yes.
trappings of it, the language, the behaviors, and we also have other industry players that obviously want to promote certain types of energy for their own benefit, I suppose. But I have a very interesting story of a MLA in the in the province of British Columbia who actually tweeted something from a well-known doctor, who namely was yourself, Patrick, no less.
Yes.
And basically, if I recall the tweet, this MLA actually expressed concern about these policies and its negative impacts on Canadians. That this is going to hurt working Canadians in terms of higher food prices, all the
Yeah,
rest.
all he did, David, was retweet my tweet.
He retweeted your tweet.
That's all he did. He didn't say anything original himself. He just
Yeah.
retweeted my tweet as if, but I guess that was presumably agreeing with it.
Right. So he was ushered out of his caucus. Is that correct?
He was fired, yes, by the head of the
That
Liberal Party.
surprise
in
you,
British
Patrick,
Columbia.
in this day and age where we can't even basically debate basic information around a policy area that is so critical and frankly, in many respects, off the rails? Did this surprise you?
I wrote a letter to the Liberal leader asking him why he wasn't allowing people to have their own opinions on this and such, but I, of course, have no reply. It was a dastardly thing to do. It really was. And you know, I'm a little bit edgy in my tweets, but I don't use foul language or anything. I just point out what I believe is the obvious about these policies, and there you go. Can I do just one? I know it's getting on now, but I'd like to do the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's a little bit more humorous than some of this
that'd be
other stuff.
terrific, Patrick.
If you go to slide number 32.
Yes. Very good.
You got it there?
Yeah.
So they claim that there is a sea of plastic garbage twice the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But as you can see there, this is a drawing. This is not a picture of the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And somehow or other, they've managed to get two giant seas of plastic. And if you go to the next slide.
Well, but just to clarify, that's a fake image. Somebody created that. That's actually not true.
And then if you'll see the next slide, 33, you can see that that's a fake image too. Not only that, but the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is not only twice the size of Texas, it's pretty much the size of the lower 48.
Yeah, no,
but no one can see it from the beach. That's the thing about it. It's invisible. So in the next slide you go to, You see, a new continent, plastic nation, has emerged and threatens to kill the oceans in less than 10 years.
Mhm.
How is that going to kill the oceans? It's a painting on the ocean. Somebody just took a satellite image of the Earth and put some brown blob on the ocean. Because if you go to the next slide, now you really see the Pacific Garbage Patch. See, it says a part of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch there. This is really nasty because this is actually the aftermath of the Japanese tsunami that killed 20,000 people and wiped whole towns off the surface.
Yeah.
And I figured this out. How did I figure it out? There's land in the background. There's no land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
So that's what you're looking at here. It's not just
So to be clear, they used the tragedy
Yes.
of the Japanese tsunami that killed some 20,000 people, used a picture of the trash that had flowed off that tragedy to spin it as the so-called giant island circle of trash in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which clearly it is not. Is that what
So
you're
let's
saying?
see the next slide. Yes, I think it's immoral what they've done here. There's a lot of things they do that are immoral. The next slide, 36, is an actual composite of the whole Pacific Ocean from a German satellite that obviously there's clouds everywhere sometimes.
Right.
So what they do is they take picture every day and then they use the parts that aren't cloudy and make a composite. But it's real. This is a real photograph of the Pacific Ocean. You can see the Hawaiian Islands. Even some of the little ones you can see there. It's not twice the size of Texas, the Hawaiian Islands. There is no Pacific Garbage Patch. And when you challenge people on this, and as I have done in many mixed audiences where there are people who believe in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, they come up to you and say, well, it's just the clear plastic. That's why you can't see it. And
No kidding.
that gives them away because clear plastic is actually denser than water and sinks to the bottom. So, okay, they give up on that one when I explain that to them. They say, well, it's just below the surface. There's another line they have. Oh, yes, each piece of plastic has a buoyancy compensation device on it to hold it at just below the surface of the sea. It doesn't work like that. Most things either float or sink. And then when it comes right down to it, oh, it's microplastic. In other words, it's invisible. That's why you can't see it, because it's all microplastic.
Right.
Well, that's quite a bit different than the pictures of the giant sea of plastic twice the size of Texas. So that's where they end up, though, is it's microplastic. But on the other hand, they say it takes 2,000 years for plastic to break down. Well, then how did it get into be microplastic if it takes 2,000 years to decompose?
Wow.
So it's all complete phony and fake, that there is no Pacific Garbage Patch, and that indeed plastic in the sea is positive. Now, that's a hard one for people to swallow.
Pardon me?
Yes, it's positive in two fundamental ways, except for fish nets that are discarded because they're torn. It's not because they're plastic that they're a problem. It's because they're shaped like a fish net and they can catch fish. They're called ghost nets. So somehow a treaty has to be put together so that the fishermen, the trouble with fishermen is they only got so much room on their boat, and they want that room for fish and ice and equipment. So they don't want a damaged fish net on their boat, so they just throw it over. And if you go to no, I guess I don't have that photograph in here. Yeah. Anyways, where was I going to go with that? Oh, yes. What's good about plastic in the ocean? Well, first, there's really no difference between a piece of floating plastic and a piece of floating wood, driftwood. As a matter of fact, Western red cedar is quite toxic. Plastic is non-toxic. They have somehow managed to convince people that when plastic goes in the ocean, it gets toxic. After we've wrapped our food in it and contained all our food in it to keep it from being contaminated. That's why we use plastic with our food. And they don't see any contradiction there. Plastic is is inert. It is not toxic. They call PVC the poison plastic. Nothing could be less poisonous.
Well, I think part of the irony to this, Patrick, what I see, and as a former municipal official, is I realize that we have to prioritize, and we like to think all of us care deeply about the environment. Is There's so much energy put into these types of almost faux debates. We're ignoring the massive amount of pollution from select municipalities who dump really raw sewage, municipal waste into the oceans, whether it's Victoria, I believe the last time I checked, they're still doing that, or Montreal, or even Halifax. So I know that there's efforts to deal with this, but there's numerous examples by the thousands across Canada where from time to time municipal wastewater surcharges into rivers and oceans. And that would seem like the first priority to deal with, wouldn't it, if you care about the environment?
Yes, that is an important area. There's no doubt about it. The other benefit of plastic in the sea, Sir David Attenborough claims that adult albatross are feeding plastic bags to their chicks, mistaking it for food. Sorry. That's what he said. They are not giving their chicks plastic, mistaking it for food, and they are not bringing plastic bags to their chicks. There's no photograph or documentation of that whatsoever. If you go on the internet, you will find all these pictures of baby albatross sliced open with like 2 pounds of plastic things in their insides.
Wow, horrific.
It's not true. They're staged pictures, just like the garbage patch is. They're staged, these photos. The reason that seabirds take hard bits of plastic of the appropriate size and bring it to their chicks is because all birds have gizzards. No, birds do not have teeth. They cannot chew their food. So they have 2 stomachs, one like ours, which is an acid digestion, but for more difficult, large pieces of food like a squid, it goes to the gizzard. And in the gizzard, hard pieces of stuff are used to grind it. On land, birds use pebbles. When chicks are in the nest, the parents bring them pebbles and put them in their mouth, so they swallow them into their gizzard, where they become a grinding agent. Like the beak of a squid is retained in the gizzard when the squid is digested to act as one of those grinding agents. But in the sea, there are no pebbles. So the birds prefer pumice. That's their favorite, but it's from undersea volcanoes and isn't always around. But when pumice is available floating on the surface, because pumice is full of air, so it actually is a rock that's floating, they use that. They also use hard bits of wood. They use nuts, like a acorn. They'd use something like that. And now, for the last 60 years, they've been using hard bits of plastic that are suitable for that purpose, not plastic bags. Bits of floating hard plastic are used. This has been studied for 50 years by bird scientists on islands out in the Pacific and elsewhere. And there's no evidence of any harm being caused by this. As a matter of fact, it gives them an additional opportunity to find something that they can give to their chicks. And they do that themselves all their lives. The adult birds continue to ingest hard objects for their gizzards all their lives. It's just a fact.
What a fascinating insight. As I turn to kind of wrap up here, Patrick, our fascinating discussion, I did want to ask you for a sense of hope or recommendation to Canadians and others around the world in terms of what we can do, given the kind of, frankly, misinformation. We all care deeply about the environment. What should we do? What is your advice?
Read my book.
Read your book. Yes, indeed.
Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. It has about 2,500 reviews on Amazon now, 94% 4 and 5 star. It is a book that anybody with a grade 9 education can read easily. It doesn't have big words, and where there are a few big words, I explain carefully what they mean. And just the chapter on coral reefs is a fascinating read. If you turn to slide number 37. And this thing about the Great Barrier Reef really troubled me, because they use language like nearly dead. And the Great Barrier Reef has never been nearly dead. It gets damaged by hurricanes, and it gets damaged by the crown of thorns starfish. But it is basically in really good health. And actually, it's not the warmest reef in the world. The warmest oceans in the world are in Indonesia, in what's called the Coral Triangle, where there are 600 species of coral and 2,000 species of reef fish, by far the most highest biodiversity of any reef area in the world, in the warmest oceans in the world.
Fascinating.
The Coral Triangle represents a sanctuary. Remember, I showed you the 50 million year cooling period. During that period, the Caribbean, which is the second warmest ocean in the world, has lost 50% of its coral species because it got colder. If the world warmed, the coral reefs would expand. It's just a fact. You see, that if you look at where Indonesia is and where the Caribbean is, both of them are protected from northern and southern cold waters. Whereas the Great Barrier Reef actually gets some cold water from the Southern Ocean coming up there once in a while, which is why it doesn't have as many species of corals and reef fish as the Coral Triangle does. And it's interesting, the World Wildlife Fund recognizes the Coral Triangle as the most biodiverse reef in the world, and then at the same time says if the oceans get warmer, the corals will die. It's just not true. Corals love warm water. You don't see any corals in Finland, or anywhere outside the tropics, really. I have a place in Baja, southern Baja, Mexico, which is just 5 miles south of the Tropic of Cancer. And that is where the first reefs are found, inside the tropical zone. And our reefs at Cabo Pulmo, beautiful place to go and dive, but there's only about 3 different kinds of coral. There's quite a few more reef fish than that, but it's not 2,000. So if you really want to see the most beautiful thing in the world, it's so different from anything you see on the land, and so beautiful and colorful that everybody should see it who is capable of putting on a snorkel and fins. And the water's nice and comfortable. You don't need a wetsuit, but most professional snorkelers do put a wetsuit on to protect them from stinging things and stuff like that. Eileen and I, my wife and I, have been there twice on 10-day expeditions in the Indonesian waters. One expedition on the western side of Papua, which is called Papua, and then another one through the archipelago of islands on the bottom of Indonesia, going from Bali to Lombok to Flores, and also where the dragons are, Komodo. There's a string of islands there like pearls. And what a wonderful thing to see. If everybody in the world should see it, because it makes you realize how beautiful life is, how abundant it is, and how warm water is actually really beneficial for marine life. Not that cold water isn't, but you don't see the biodiversity anywhere else in the world. And my book has a very good chapter on this, showing how high the biodiversity is in that region compared to the rest of the world's oceans. It's spectacular.
Wow. Well, on that note, Dr. Patrick Moore, I want to thank you so much for that encouragement in terms of, frankly, a lot of good things that are happening in our environment, and for bringing a very critical analysis based on your scientific insight on, frankly, what's happening when it comes to environmental policy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick.
Thank you, David, and thank the Frontier Institute for having me, Frontier Center, for having me as a guest. And Goodbye, everybody. And it's been nice being with you. And again, I hope you'll find that my book has 10 times as much information as I've been able to give you in this short period. And it's, well, I find it fascinating, and I hope you do too. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you for your courage and insights and for joining us here today. Dr. Patrick Moore, Senior Fellow with the Frontier. So that brings us to an end here on our time together. I encourage you to keep involved with the Frontier, and we certainly welcome your comments. I did want to highlight a number of announcements, one of which is that on our next Leaders of the Frontier, we'll be featuring on September the 22nd, Leon Fontaine, a leader wearing many different hats, discussing the importance of civil society, shared values, and leadership. I'm also pleased to announce that on September the 30th, on Policy on Leaders on the Frontier, we are delighted to welcome two of the three authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Martin Kulldorff. This will be a far-reaching discussion on their experience as scientists who played such a key role in the lessons learned from COVID-19 and where does the world go from here. Well, that brings an end to our session. Frontier does not accept any government funding, so your support, your donations make our mission possible. So thank you so much. And remember, without open discussion and debate, you are not thinking, and nor are you free. Keep asking good questions and do not be afraid. And on behalf of all of us at the Frontier, thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.